In the late Middle Ages, the boundaries between spiritual law and civil authority were indistinguishable. Kings ruled by divine right, but even they feared the wrath of the Church. Inquisitors held the power to summon, to judge, and to condemn in the name of God, and their reach extended into every chamber, every field, and every bed. In this climate of fear and unquestioned obedience, a single rumor could destroy not only a life, but a family's legacy. The noblewoman, whose name would later be stricken from parish records, had been born into privilege. Her family's estate provided them with influence among the local lords, but also made them visible targets in political struggles between the nobility and the bishopric. She had been raised to understand her value not as an individual, but as a symbol, a vessel for alliances, dares, and heirs. Her life, like those of other women of her station, was not hers to direct. The priest, by contrast, had risen from poverty. His calling to the Church had been encouraged from childhood, not for piety alone, but because it offered the only path to education and status available to someone of his birth. By the time he was ordained, he had learned the subtle art of balancing spiritual guidance with political diplomacy, yet no amount of training could erase the fact that a parish priest was bound by vows of obedience, poverty, and above all, chastity. The two met not in secrecy at first, but within the confines of expected social interaction. She attended Mass in the small chapel on her family's lands, where he delivered sermons drawn as much from Scripture as from the pressing struggles of his flock. He visited the estate to bless the harvest, to minister to the servants, to hear confessions in the damp alcove behind the chapel. It was during these visits that words became glances, and glances became something far more dangerous. In medieval Europe, the Church's prohibitions against clerical marriage were not merely moral. They were political. A priest with a family could pass property or influence to heirs, undermining the Church's control over wealth and land. By forbidding marriage, the Church ensured that its property and power remained undivided, its servants loyal only to Rome. For a priest to enter into an intimate relationship was to defy a system designed to keep him bound, body and soul, to the institution. Rumors began quietly. Servants noticed the priest's visits grew more frequent, his stays longer. Neighbors whispered that confessions took hours, that her penances were light, that she lingered near the chapel after Mass. In an age where sin was seen not just as a personal failing, but as a contagion threatening the entire community, such whispers could not be ignored. The bishop's court had long been searching for an opportunity to weaken her family's influence. Aligning themselves too closely with secular lords had made her relatives enemies within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. This alleged affair provided the perfect weapon and accusation that combined sexual immorality, violation of sacred vows, and defiance of the Church's authority. When the summons arrived, it bore the seal of the Holy Office. Both she and the priest were ordered to appear before an ecclesiastical tribunal, an inquisition not for heresy of doctrine, but for heresy of conduct. In the eyes of the Church, to tempt a priest into sin was an offense nearly equal to denying God himself. The language of the charge sheet was cold and absolute: corruption of the sacred, violation of holy vows, scandal to the faithful, and rebellion against the moral order. Public knowledge of the summons was enough to ruin reputations before a word of testimony was given. Neighbors withdrew their greetings. Tenants avoided her gaieties. The priest's parishioners began to skip confession, unwilling to place their souls in the care of a man they believed had fallen. Guilt or innocence became irrelevant. In a system where the Church both accused and judged, the outcome was never in doubt. The cultural weight of such accusations cannot be overstated. In a society where salvation was mediated entirely through the Church, excommunication, or even the threat of it, was a kind of living death. It cut the accused off from sacraments, from burial in consecrated ground, and from the eternal hope of heaven. To stand before the tribunal was not merely to risk earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. The tribunal's first step was to separate the accused. The woman was confined to a bare chamber within the bishop's palace, denied letters or visits from her family. The priest was taken to the lower cells, where the cold stone floor and absence of light served as his first taste of penance. Their interrogations began at dawn, each session designed to wear away resistance. The questions were repetitive, the accusations unrelenting, the scripture selectively chosen to reinforce guilt. In truth, the evidence was circumstantial, but in the logic of the age, circumstantial evidence was often enough. A woman's testimony was considered inherently suspect, especially if it contradicted that of a man of the cloth, and a priest who confessed under torture, whether his words were sincere or extracted through agony, was deemed to have spoken the truth. Their confessions, when finally recorded, bore the marks of coercion. She admitted to improper familiarity. He confessed to neglect of vows. In the tribunal's records, these phrases would be taken as absolute proof, the nuanced realities of emotion, affection, and human weakness erased entirely. By the time the verdict was reached, the political purpose of the trial was complete. Her family's standing was diminished, their loyalty to the church unquestioningly reinforced by fear. The priest's parish was reassigned to a younger, more controllable cleric. The message to the community was unmistakable: love, when it transgressed the boundaries set by the church, would be met not with mercy, but with ruin. In the end, their crime was not passion, nor even the breaking of vows, but the defiance of a system that demanded complete submission. In the eyes of their judges, the body could be destroyed to save the soul, and if that meant extinguishing both, it was a sacrifice they were willing to make. The tribunal of the Holy Office convened not in a grand cathedral, but in a stone hall stripped of ornament. The architecture reflected the nature of its work, unadorned, cold, and final. At its center stood the raised bench where the inquisitors sat, their authority drawn from papal decree. Beneath them, the accused waited, not as defendants in the modern sense, but as souls already presumed corrupted. In the late medieval world, the Inquisition had become a machine designed to enforce conformity. Its reach extended beyond questions of theology. It policed morality, loyalty, and obedience. To be summoned was to stand against an institution that claimed to speak for God himself. Even kings, in certain matters, bent their will before its judgments. When the noblewoman was brought forward, she was flanked by 2 guards in plain robes, a deliberate reminder that she was under ecclesiastical jurisdiction, beyond the protection of her family's name. The priest entered separately, shackled at the wrists. The tribunal's procedure was designed to prevent solidarity between the accused. The mere exchange of a glance could be construed as collusion. The inquisitors began with a recitation of charges. Each offense was named slowly, deliberately, with scripture cited as its mirror. Carnal commerce with a consecrated man, they intuned, leading to the corruption of his holy vows. Scandal to the faithful, defiance of the authority of the church. These were not mere accusations. They were declarations of spiritual treason. Inquisitorial courts operated on the principle that confession was the highest form of evidence. It was not enough for the tribunal to believe the accused guilty. The accused had to say it themselves. This was presented as an act of spiritual cleansing, but in reality, it served to validate the court's power. A confession under duress was still counted as the voice of the soul. The first stage was verbal interrogation. The questions were repetitive and accusatory, framed to lead toward admission. How long have you conspired? How often have you met in secret? Did you tempt the servant of God into abandoning his vows? The answers, no matter how carefully worded, were written down by scribes who interpreted them through the lens of guilt. Silence was dangerous. In an inquisitorial setting, refusal to speak could be interpreted as contempt or further proof of sin. Yet speaking could be worse. Each word became a thread for the inquisitors to pull, unraveling the accused's defense until nothing remained but the court's own narrative. When verbal resistance proved too strong, the tribunal authorized the use of methods of persuasion. This was not punishment in their terminology, but a sacred duty to save the soul through the confession of sin. The instruments were brought from a separate chamber, their presence alone often enough to break resolve. The priest was taken first. As a man of the church, his fall from grace carried a special weight. He was strapped to the strappado, his wrists bound behind his back, a rope running upward to a pulley. He was raised slowly, his shoulders dislocating under his own weight, before being dropped sharply to jar the joints. Each time he fell, the inquisitor repeated the question, "Did you corrupt the sanctity of your office?" The answers, gasped through clenched teeth, grew weaker with each drop. The noblewoman faced a different method, one deemed more fitting for her gender. The water ordeal. Bound to a board, cloth pressed into her mouth. Water was poured slowly until breathing became a desperate struggle. This was not intended to drown, but to create the sensation of drowning, an experience so overwhelming that few could resist giving the desired answers. To the inquisitors, this was not cruelty, but the necessary cleansing of a sinful tongue. Days blurred into one another. Sessions began before dawn and stretched until nightfall. Rest was given, but never enough to restore clarity. The accused were fed sparingly, their physical weakness becoming another lever of control. Guards reported on their every movement, every expression, as evidence of contrition or defiance. The interrogations were punctuated by readings from Scripture, carefully chosen to support the court's position. Passages on obedience, purity, and the wages of sin were recited, as though the words themselves were divine endorsements of the inquisitor's work. To resist was to reject the word of God. Eventually, both yielded. The priest admitted to neglecting the purity of the cloth. The noblewoman confessed to tempting a servant of the altar into moral ruin. These confessions were written in the formal hand of the court scribe, each statement stamped with the tribunal's seal. Whether the words reflected truth was irrelevant. The record itself became the truth. With confession secured, the purpose of the trial shifted from inquiry to demonstration. The public would be informed of their guilt, not simply to punish, but to instruct. In the logic of the age, sin was a sickness, and its cure lay in public acknowledgement followed by cleansing fire or iron. In the final moments before sentencing, the inquisitors reminded them that this was an act of mercy. By confessing, they had saved their souls from eternal damnation, even if their bodies were to be destroyed. The paradox was deliberate, to ensure that the condemned would face their punishment not as victims, but as sinners who believed their fate was just. For the tribunal, the verdict was not the conclusion of a process, but the performance of its authority. Guilt had been predetermined. The trial was the means of transforming accusation into absolute truth. The noblewoman and the priest would leave the hall not as individuals, but as symbols, living proof that the Church's will could reach into any heart, any home, any body. In the court of holy terror, justice was not blind, it was all-seeing, all-hearing, and absolute. The tribunal did not seek to discover truth, it sought to create it, and in its records, written in the unshakable ink of confession, no one was ever innocent. The tribunal chamber was silent when the presiding inquisitor rose to speak. The verdict, though inevitable, was delivered with the gravity of divine judgment. Before him stood the noblewoman and the priest, stripped not only of their defenses, but of their dignity. Their confessions, extracted under duress, had become the unshakable foundation of their fate. Inquisitorial sentencing was more than legal procedure, it was ritual. The words spoken by the court were meant to echo not just in the ears of the condemned, but in the conscience of the entire community. Each phrase was drawn from canon law, each clause wrapped in Scripture, giving the impression that the punishment came not from men, but from God Himself. The charges were recited again, slowly and deliberately. Carnal commerce in violation of holy vows, corruption of the faithful, defiance of ecclesiastical authority. The inquisitor's voice did not waver. There would be no mercy, no mitigation. The Church could not afford to show leniency in matters that touched its very sanctity. The sentence was pronounced in the language of the court. They would be delivered to the secular arm for execution. This phrasing was a calculated fiction. The Inquisition maintained the appearance that it did not shed blood. It merely handed sinners to the civil authorities. In truth, the secular officials acted under the Church's command, bound to carry out the sentence exactly as prescribed. Execution by fire was chosen not simply for its finality, but for its symbolism. Fire was the purifier, the instrument through which the soul could be cleansed of its earthly corruption. In theological reasoning, it was the closest mortal men could come to the purgation of sin. But the reality was far starker. It was slow, public, and designed to terrorize. The date was fixed, and word spread quickly through the town and surrounding countryside. Attendance at such events was not optional. Failure to witness the punishment could itself be seen as a sign of sympathy or dissent. Parents brought their children, merchants closed their shops, and peasants walked for miles to stand in the crowd. The execution ground would serve as both theater and sermon. In the days before the sentence, the condemned were visited by confessors whose task was not to comfort, but to ensure their submission to the church's narrative. The noblewoman was pressed to publicly repent for leading a servant of the altar into ruin. The priest was urged to declare himself a warning to others who might be tempted by earthly desire. Their final words, if they complied, would become part of the church's moral instruction. The clothing of the condemned was also a matter of ritual. They would wear the sanbenito, a penitential garment painted with flames and devils, a visible declaration of their guilt. For her, the sanbenito was designed to strip away her noble status, marking her not as a lady, but as a sinner. For him, it erased the sacred authority of the priesthood, reducing him to a man awaiting judgment. On the morning of the execution, the town bell tolled slowly, not for mourning, but as a summons. The condemned were led from their cells, chained and surrounded by guards. They were paraded through the streets so that all could see their shame, the crowd spitting curses or crossing themselves in fear. The procession ended at the open square where the stake had been prepared, a tall post surrounded by a pyre of wood and kindling. The inquisitor addressed the crowd first. His sermon recounted the charges, the confessions, and the church's mercy in granting them the chance to cleanse their souls through this final act. He reminded the people that sin spreads like disease, and that only through vigilance and obedience could the community remain pure. The civil executioner stepped forward, though he did not act until the inquisitor signaled. The condemned were bound tightly to the stake, ropes and chains holding them upright. The priest was positioned so that he could see the noblewoman, and she could see him, a final humiliation that ensured their last moments were shared under the eyes of the public. Before the fire was lit, each was offered one final chance to speak. The priest murmured a prayer, his voice hoarse, his words swallowed by the crowd's murmur. The noblewoman's voice was steadier, though stripped of defiance. She recited the confession prepared for her, affirming the church's judgment. Whether these words reflected belief or were spoken to shorten her suffering, no one could know. The torch was applied to the base of the pyre. Smoke rose first, thick and acrid, followed by the crackle of dry wood catching flame. The crowd pressed closer, not from compassion, but from a mixture of fear and grim fascination. Inquisitorial executions were not swift. They were drawn out so the lesson could be fully absorbed. As the fire climbed, the inquisitor led the crowd in prayer, framing the screams not as human agony, but as the sound of souls being purified. Children were told to remember the sight, to carry it as a warning into adulthood. Neighbors whispered about other rumors, wondering who might be summoned next. When at last the flames consumed the bodies, the executioner scattered the remains to prevent any possibility of burial in consecrated ground. This, too, was part of the punishment. The denial of a resting place, the erasure of earthly identity. What remained was ash, and in the church's record, only the proof of their guilt. In the logic of the Inquisition, justice had been done. 2 lives had been extinguished, but the greater victory, they claimed, was the preservation of the community's soul. Yet in the ashes left behind, the real truth lingered. This was not salvation, but control, enforced through the language of God and the fire of men. The morning began long before sunrise. In the Inquisition's cells, the guards moved with deliberate slowness, making certain the condemned heard the clatter of keys, the echo of footsteps, the sound of the door being unbarred. Sleep was impossible. The hours before execution were part of the sentence, a final stripping away of hope. Outside, the town stirred under the tolling of the bell. Its deep, hollow sound carried far into the surrounding countryside, a summons that could not be ignored. Attendance was both a civic and spiritual duty. Absence could be noted and questioned. Farmers left their fields untended. Merchants shuttered their stalls, and mothers pulled their children along, telling them they must witness the justice of God. The condemned were dressed in their sanbenitos, their identities reduced to painted symbols of flame and damnation. For the noblewoman, the garment was an erasure of her status. For the priest, it was the visible death of his sacred office. No jewelry, no personal possessions, nothing that could suggest individuality was permitted. They were no longer people, they were examples. The procession began at the bishop's palace. Soldiers marched ahead, carrying banners of the church, followed by robed officials bearing crosses and relics. The condemned walked barefoot, flanked by guards who kept them separated. Behind them trailed the civil executioner, carrying the tools that would be used to bind them to the stake. The streets were lined with onlookers. Some spat, some prayed, some stared in silence. The route was purposeful. It wound through the busiest parts of the town so that no one could avoid the sight. The priest passed the chapel where he had once preached. The noblewoman passed the marketplace, where she had been seen as a figure of authority. Every familiar place was transformed into a stage for their humiliation. At the center of the square stood the execution scaffold, a raised platform so that even those at the farthest edge of the crowd could see. The stake rose above it, surrounded by a carefully arranged pyre of wood. The pile had been built the night before, layer upon layer of kindling and heavier logs, so that the fire would burn both quickly and long enough to serve its purpose. The inquisitor mounted the platform first. His sermon began with a reading from the Gospel, chosen to remind the people that the Church's justice was God's justice. He spoke of sin as a contagion, of lust as the devil's gateway, and of obedience as the only shield against damnation. His voice was steady, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. The condemned were forced to kneel as he spoke, their heads bowed, not in prayer, but in submission. When he had finished, the condemned were offered one last chance to speak. The offer was less mercy than formality. The priest managed only a few words of confession, his voice raw from the weeks of interrogation. The noblewoman spoke more clearly, reciting the penitent phrases that had been prepared for her. Whether they reflected her own belief or were spoken to hasten the end, the crowd could not tell, and it did not matter. The binding was methodical. Ropes were wound around ankles, knees, waist, and chest. The executioner worked without haste, ensuring there would be no escape, no collapse before the fire took hold. Their hands were tied in front so they could be seen clasped together, the posture of prayer. A hush fell as the executioner took the torch. The first flames licked at the base of the pyre, feeding on dry straw and resin-soaked wood. Smoke rose in a sharp column. It sent a mixture of pine and pitch. The crowd shifted forward, some crossing themselves, others gripping their children's shoulders more tightly. The fire climbed slowly at first, then faster as the heat built. The inquisitor began to chant prayers, the crowd joining in, the voices of the living rising over the sounds of the burning. To the Inquisition, this was the cleansing moment, the visible purging of sin. To the condemned, it was the end of breath, of pain, of earthly ties. For the crowd, the horror was deliberate. Children were told to remember the sight, to recall the smell of smoke, to never forget what happened to those who defied the Church. The execution was not merely a punishment for two people, it was a lesson for thousands. The spectacle seared obedience into memory. When the bodies were consumed, the executioner stirred the embers with a long pole, ensuring nothing remained intact. Bones were broken into fragments, ash scattered. The Church forbade burial in consecrated ground for heretics and those guilty of moral crimes. The destruction of the remains was as much a denial of legacy as it was a disposal of evidence. By the time the crowd began to disperse, the stake stood bare, blackened against the pale sky. The square reeked of smoke, a smell that would cling to clothing for days. The merchants reopened their stalls, farmers returned to their fields, and the rhythm of life resumed. Outwardly unchanged, but marked forever by what they had seen. In the official record, the day would be described as a triumph of justice, a cleansing of the community. The Church's authority had been reinforced, its power demonstrated in the most visible way possible. But beneath the surface, there was unease. Some whispered that the punishment had been too severe, others that the accused had been pawns in a larger political game. These whispers would never be spoken aloud where the wrong ears could hear. The fire was out, the crowd dispersed, the sentence complete, but the real work of the execution had only just begun. In the minds of all who had watched, the flames would keep burning, a reminder that obedience was not a choice, but a condition for survival. When the flames had finally reduced her body to ash, the crowd began to thin. Merchants packed away their wares, and the guards began dismantling the barriers that had kept the public at bay. To most, the execution was over. But for the officials of the Inquisition, a far more private act of judgment still remained. The pyre's remains were raked over with long iron hooks. Fragments of bone, brittle and white, were collected into a small wooden box. The ash itself was scooped into a linen sack, sealed tightly with wax. This was not for preservation, nor for burial. It was for the continuation of punishment. The Church taught that heretics and grave sinners should be denied burial in consecrated ground, their remains scattered so that no place could become a site of remembrance or veneration. Yet in some cases, those remains became tools for a more intimate form of cruelty. The noblewoman had left behind a son barely 10 years old. Orphan now in both law and life, he was the last living link to her name. The Inquisition viewed him not as an innocent, but as an extension of her sin, a vessel that could carry defiance into the next generation. In the logic of their authority, he too required purification. The boy had been kept under guard since the day of her arrest, housed in the damp quarters of a monastery. The friars who tended him were not permitted to speak of her, and he was forbidden to ask questions. His daily life was reduced to prayer, meager food, and the occasional rebuke for lingering too long in thought. On the day after her execution, he was summoned to the bishop's private chapel. There, waiting on a stone altar, was the sack of ash. The chamber was dim, lit only by candles, their flames flickering in the stillness. A senior cleric stood behind the altar, flanked by 2 guards. The boy was brought forward and told, without explanation, that this was the final act of cleansing for his family. The ritual, they claimed, was one of spiritual purification. By consuming a token amount of her remains, the boy would symbolically purge the sin she had carried, preventing it from passing to him. This was the justification, a theological veneer placed over an act of deliberate humiliation and trauma. In reality, it was designed to ensure that his memory of her would forever be bound to shame and revulsion. The cleric untied the sack and reached inside with a small wooden spoon. What he withdrew was not pure ash, but a gray mixture containing fine bone dust. He placed it into a cup of water, swirling it until the liquid turned cloudy. Then, with a voice heavy with solemnity, he commanded the boy to drink. Witnesses recorded that the boy hesitated, his hands trembling. A guard gripped his shoulders, forcing him to remain still. The cleric repeated the order. To refuse would be to disobey the Church, an act that could mark him as a heretic by inheritance. At last, the boy lifted the cup to his lips and swallowed. The taste, acrid and bitter, would linger for the rest of his life. The act was brief, but its impact was enduring. He was told he was now cleansed, that his mother's sin could no longer stain him. Yet the cleansing came with a command. He must never speak of her again, never recall her with affection, never honor her memory. The ashes that remained were carried away and scattered in an unmarked field outside the town. No marker was placed, no prayer was said. The Church's goal was total erasure, not only of her life, but of any trace that she had existed at all. Her name was removed from parish records, her family discouraged from mentioning her even in private. The boy's guardianship was transferred to a distant relative known for his loyalty to the bishopric. In the years that followed, the story of his mother's death would be spoken of only in whispers, and always as a warning. Any hint of sympathy for her was enough to draw suspicion, and suspicion could be fatal. For the Inquisition, the ritual had served its purpose. It had transformed a child into a living testament to their reach, a reminder that their authority extended not only over the living, but over memory itself. The execution had destroyed her body. The ashes in his mouth had been meant to destroy the bond between mother and son. The psychological cruelty of the act cannot be overstated. In a society where faith governed every aspect of life and salvation was believed to hinge on obedience, the boy was left with no safe place for grief. He could not speak her name, could not mourn her publicly, and could not reconcile the love he had known with the condemnation he had been taught to accept. Historians who later uncovered records of the event noted its rarity, but not its impossibility. The use of human remains in acts of forced ritual consumption, while not common, was documented in several inquisitorial cases. In each, the goal was the same: to turn a personal loss into a permanent instrument of fear. For the church officials involved, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was strategy. By ensuring that even the family of the condemned carried the weight of shame, they discouraged others from straying beyond the boundaries they enforced. The lesson was clear: defy the church, and your punishment will outlive you, staining those you love most. Long after the ashes had been scattered, the boy carried them still, not in his hands, but in his memory. What the Inquisition had intended as purification became a private torment, an unhealed wound that outlived the fire that had made it. The Inquisition understood that fear alone was not enough to preserve its authority. Fear could fade over time, shame endured. To secure lasting obedience, the punishment of heretics and moral offenders was as much about public degradation as it was about physical destruction. This was the purpose of the ritual of shame, a carefully staged sequence of humiliation performed before the eyes of the community, meant to stain a person's name for generations. For the noblewoman condemned for her relationship with the priest, the fire had been the final act, but the ritual began long before the stake was lit. From the moment of arrest, every step was calculated to strip away identity. Her fine clothing was replaced with rough wool, dyed a dull yellow, the color of betrayal in much of medieval Europe. Her hair was cut short, a mark of disgrace for women of status. Every change was a visible sign to onlookers that she was no longer a lady, but a sinner. The priest's transformation was no less deliberate. His clerical robes were torn from him in a public ceremony called the degradation of orders. Before witnesses, each vestment was removed in symbolic reversal of the ordination rites. His tonsure, the circle of hair that marked him as a servant of God, was shaved away entirely. What had been a sacred mark was turned into a sign of dishonor. The ritual of shame was as much performance as it was punishment. Processions through the streets were central to the spectacle. The condemned were paraded barefoot, often with heavy chains around their necks or ankles, and forced to carry symbols of their crime. For the noblewoman, it was a placard bearing the words, "Corrupter of the Faithful." For the priest, a wooden cross painted black, an inversion of the symbol he had once lifted in blessing. Crowds gathered along the road, encouraged by officials to jeer and spit. Children were pushed forward to shout insults, their voices unrestrained by the politeness usually afforded to social superiors. In this moment, rank and privilege were erased. The condemned stood alone, exposed to the judgment of those they had once commanded or guided. At the heart of the ritual was the sanbenito, the penitential tunic painted with flames, devils, and symbols of sin. These garments were not destroyed after execution. Instead, they were hung in the local church, displayed alongside the names of the condemned. In this way, the memory of their disgrace lived on, confronting parishioners each time they entered for Mass. The sanbenito served as a silent sermon: this is what happens to those who stray. The noblewoman's family suffered their own measure of public humiliation. Though they had not been charged with any crime, they were compelled to attend the execution and the preceding processions. Their presence was a form of enforced complicity, a public acknowledgement that they accepted the church's judgment. Neighbors would remember their bowed heads, their silent walk behind her, for years to come. The boy, too, was drawn into the ritual. His forced ingestion of her ashes was part of a private act, but its intention was the same: to sever loyalty and love, replacing them with shame and fear. Though few witnessed it directly, the knowledge of it was allowed to spread in whispers, ensuring that his place in the community would forever be marked by the act. Ritualized shame did not end with the execution day. The condemned's property was often confiscated and redistributed, sometimes to the church, sometimes to loyal supporters of the bishopric. Their homes might be dismantled, their coats of arms defaced or removed from public display. In extreme cases, the very stones of their house were carted away, erasing not just their lives, but their physical presence in the landscape. These measures served a dual purpose. They punished the family, ensuring that the stain of the crime could not be washed away through wealth or influence. And they reminded the wider community that the Church's justice was total. It reached into the home, into the family, and into the memory of the dead. The theological justification for such public degradation was framed in terms of moral instruction. Clerics argued that the humiliation of the sinner was a warning to others, a chance for the faithful to strengthen their resolve against temptation. But in practice, it was a demonstration of the Church's capacity to define and destroy reputations. Historical records from the period show that once a person's name appeared on the list of the condemned, their descendants often carried the burden for generations. Marriage prospects diminished, positions in guilds or civic offices were denied. Even if the original charges were later questioned, the mark of shame was rarely erased. In this way, the ritual achieved what execution alone could not. It turned the sinner's memory into a tool of social control. For the noblewoman and the priest, the flames had ended their lives, but the sanbenitos hanging in the church ensured they would be remembered only for their disgrace. Parishioners would pass beneath them every Sunday, glancing up at the painted flames and reading the names aloud to their children. No mention would be made of the circumstances of their arrest, the coercion of their confessions, or the political motives that may have shaped their fate. The narrative was fixed: they had sinned, they had been punished, and their shame was eternal. Long after the pyre's embers cooled, the ritual of shame continued to do its work. The bodies were gone, the voices silenced, but their disgrace lived on, not in truth, but in the carefully crafted memory the Inquisition left behind. The execution square was empty by morning, save for the blackened stake and the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the air. The ashes had been scattered, the sanbenitos hung in the church, and the officials had recorded the verdicts in the tribunal's ledgers. In the eyes of the Inquisition, the matter was closed. But for those connected to the condemned, the real sentence was only beginning. The noblewoman's family returned to their estate under watchful eyes. Their status, once secure, was now precarious. Neighbors who had once greeted them warmly now crossed to the other side of the street. Trade agreements were quietly dissolved, marriage contracts withdrawn. The charge against her had become a stain on the entire bloodline. It did not matter that the family had neither approved nor participated in her actions. In the logic of the time, sin was contagious. The boy, marked forever by the ritual he had been forced to endure, found himself an object of both pity and suspicion. The church claimed he had been purified, yet the same priests who spoke those words kept him at a distance. In school, other children repeated the words they had heard from their parents. Heretic son. His very existence was a reminder of defiance against ecclesiastical authority, and that was a dangerous thing to be. The family's property, already diminished by fines and confiscations, began to erode further. The best parcels of farmland were reassigned to men who had proven their loyalty to the bishopric. The grain stores were levied to supply the cathedral, leaving less for the household through the winter. The punishment was not announced as such, but the effect was unmistakable. Each loss was another step toward dependence on the very institution that had destroyed them. In the town, the sanbenitos hanging in the church became a constant reminder of the Inquisition's reach. Each Sunday, the congregation passed beneath the painted flames, bearing the names of the noblewoman and the priest. Children asked their parents who they were, and the answer was always the same: sinners who defied God. The details of the case mattered little. The story had been stripped down to its moral function. The priest's parish, now in the hands of a younger cleric favored by the bishop, was carefully rebuilt to erase any trace of its former shepherd. His sermons, his teachings, his charitable works, all were quietly omitted from the record. Parishioners who had once been close to him kept silent, fearing that even kind words might be interpreted as sympathy for a condemned man. Isolation became the family's daily reality. Invitations to feasts and festivals ceased. Guild members who had once done business with them began to trade elsewhere. The social death imposed by the Inquisition was as deliberate as the physical execution. It ensured that no one would dare to associate too closely with those marked by disgrace. For the boy, the weight of this isolation grew heavier with time. His education, once intended to prepare him for managing the estate, was redirected toward menial tasks. Apprenticeships were denied. Marriage prospects evaporated before they could be discussed. A hereticate's son could not be allowed to join the ranks of the influential, lest the stain of his bloodline spread upward into positions of authority. Even beyond the immediate community, the Inquisition's records traveled. Other towns, upon hearing his family name, turned away opportunities. The network of church officials ensured that the memory of the case was not confined to one parish. The punishment was not only perpetual, it was portable. For those who dared to question the justice of the case, the lesson was clear: speak too openly, and you might find yourself summoned to the same tribunal. Dissent was a dangerous indulgence. Even whispers within the family had to be guarded, lest a careless servant or resentful neighbor report them. This atmosphere of fear served the Inquisition's broader purpose: to make examples so thorough that the thought of resistance never took root. Years passed, and still the Sanbenitos hung in the church. The fabric grew worn, the paint faded, but they remained. Children who had once been told the story grew up to tell it to their own children, each retelling stripping away complexity until only the verdict remained. The noblewoman and the priest were no longer remembered as people, but as cautionary figures in the morality play of the Inquisition. For the boy, now a man, the past could not be escaped. The ashes he had been forced to swallow as a child became a private symbol of everything he had lost: his mother, his family's honor, and his place in the world. In a time when public confession and penance could sometimes restore a person to partial favor, he knew there was nothing he could confess that would erase the crime the Church had assigned to him by blood. Historians, looking back on such cases, note that this was precisely the point. The Inquisition's cruelty was not merely about punishing the guilty. It was about shaping the memory of the living, ensuring that each execution and each act of humiliation lived on as a tool of governance. The family's ongoing suffering was not an unfortunate side effect. It was the intended outcome. The fire had burned for an hour, but the sentence lasted a lifetime. For the family, and especially for the boy, the true punishment was not the death they had witnessed, but the slow erasure of everything that had once given their lives meaning. In this way, the Inquisition ensured that its reach extended far beyond the grave. For the priest, the sentence did not come with a fixed date of execution. Instead, the Inquisition consigned him to its prison, a place designed not for rehabilitation, but for erasure. The tribunal claimed this was an act of mercy. His life would be spared if he accepted perpetual confinement. In truth, such a sentence was often worse than death. The inquisitorial prison lay beneath the bishop's palace, a network of low, damp corridors carved from stone. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew, stale water, and human decay. Light entered only in thin slivers from grates above, and even those disappeared when the weather turned. Time itself lost meaning in such a place. Days and nights bled together in the unbroken gloom. The priest's cell measured little more than a coffin's length in width. A single straw mat served as bedding, but it was rarely dry. The walls sweated in the winter cold and stifled in summer heat. Food came twice a day, black bread, sometimes accompanied by a thin broth, passed through a small hatch in the door. Speaking to other prisoners was forbidden. Silence was enforced as part of his penance. His degradation had begun at the trial, when the vestments of his priesthood were torn from him in the ceremony of defrocking. Now, in prison, he was forbidden even the comfort of a rosary or a crucifix. The Church insisted this was to prevent him from misusing sacred objects, but it served another purpose: to deny him any reminder of the vocation that had once defined his life. Interrogations did not end with the trial. Weeks after sentencing, inquisitors would still summon him to the questioning room, demanding new admissions of guilt or elaborations on old ones. These sessions were not about uncovering facts, They were about reinforcing the narrative of his fall. Each time, the scribe recorded his words with cold precision, adding them to a file that would remain in the church's archives for centuries. Isolation gnawed at his mind. The absence of human contact beyond his guards eroded the clarity of his thoughts. He recited prayers in his head, but without the rhythm of the liturgy or the sound of a congregation, they began to fragment. Eventually, he found himself questioning whether the words had any meaning at all, a thought that, for a man who had once lived entirely for faith, was its own form of torment. Occasionally, a confessor was sent to his cell. These visits were not for spiritual comfort, but to extract public compliance. The confessor urged him to write letters denouncing his actions, which could be read aloud to the faithful as cautionary examples. The priest signed some of them, though whether out of belief, exhaustion, or the hope of better treatment, the record does not say. The seasons passed, marked only by the changes in the air. In summer, the cell stank of rot. In winter, frost crept across the floor. His body weakened. Joints stiffened from confinement, and his skin broke into sores from the damp straw. By the second year, he could no longer stand for more than a few minutes at a time. The church did not execute prisoners in such conditions quickly. Instead, it allowed nature, hunger, and neglect to do the work. The death that came was slow, its progress measured in the failing of the body and the quiet collapse of the will. Even as his health failed, the prison rituals continued. Guards addressed him not by name, but as the defrocked one, or simply the condemned. His identity was reduced to his crime. His past life was treated as if it had never existed. The final months were marked by fever. Without a physician, he relied on the occasional bucket of water to cool himself, though it was often fouled. The fever blurred his thoughts, and he sometimes spoke aloud to people who were not there. The guards ignored him. When the end came, it was unremarked. The record notes only that he was found lifeless in his cell on a winter morning. There was no mass for the dead, no burial in consecrated ground. His body was removed at night, carried out through a side gate, and deposited in a common pit beyond the town's walls, the resting place for criminals, the unbaptized, and those condemned by the church. The absence of ceremony was deliberate. To give him a Christian burial would have undermined the lesson his imprisonment was meant to teach. His life was to be remembered only for its fall, his death only as proof that the church's sentence had been carried out in full. The cell he had occupied was soon given to another prisoner. The straw was replaced, the walls scraped, and the cycle began again. Inquisitorial prisons were never empty for long. There was always another soul to be cleansed. For the parish he had once served, news of his death came quietly. The new priest made no mention of it from the pulpit. In private, some parishioners spoke of his kindness in the early years, of the sermons that had comforted them in times of loss. But these memories were kept behind closed doors, for to speak too openly of him was to risk suspicion. The archives would preserve his name only in the context of condemnation. Future generations, reading the tribunal's record, would see him not as a man of faith who faltered, but as an example of the corruption that the Inquisition claimed to root out. In this way, even in death, his identity was controlled. In the darkness of that cell, the priest's life was reduced to a single narrative, the one the Inquisition chose to tell. His voice was gone, his grave unmarked, and his memory bent into a weapon against others. In the machinery of the Holy Office, this was not tragedy, it was success. Officially, the charges against the noblewoman and the priest were matters of moral and spiritual corruption, fornication, violation of sacred vows, and scandal to the faithful. But to understand why the full weight of the Inquisition was brought down upon them, one must look beyond the language of sin to the realities of politics in a late medieval Catholic kingdom. In that era, the Church was not simply a spiritual authority, it was a political institution as powerful as any monarchy. Bishops wielded armies, collected taxes, and negotiated treaties. Cathedrals were as much centers of administration as they were houses of worship. The Inquisition, in turn, was its judicial arm, capable of removing rivals and consolidating power under the guise of enforcing orthodoxy. The noblewoman's family had long been a fixture of the region's landed aristocracy. Their estates controlled access to trade routes and fertile farmland, resources that the bishopric had sought to bring under its own administration. For years, tensions simmered between her relatives and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Disputes over tithes, jurisdiction, and the rights of patronage in local parishes had become regular points of contention. The arrival of a new bishop intensified the conflict. Unlike his predecessor, who had maintained an uneasy truce with the noble families, this bishop pursued aggressive consolidation. He replaced parish priests with loyal clerics, redirected taxes to the cathedral treasury, and sought to undermine the social standing of the secular nobility. To him, a scandal involving one of the most prominent local families was not just an opportunity, it was a gift. The priest's position in this political landscape was equally significant. Though technically subordinate to the bishop, he had close ties to the noblewoman's household. He heard their confessions, advised them on religious matters, and was trusted with their private concerns. His loyalty was to the family as much as to the cathedral, a fact that, in the bishop's eyes, made him a liability. The rumors of their relationship provided the perfect pretext. In a society that placed immense value on the virtue of women and the sanctity of the priesthood, a liaison between the two could be framed as an affront to both divine and social order. The Inquisition did not have to fabricate the charges, it merely had to amplify them. Once whispers began, the machinery of accusation moved swiftly. By pursuing the case through the Holy Office, rather than a secular court, the bishop ensured that the process would be entirely under ecclesiastical control. Civil law might have imposed fines, exile, or lesser forms of public penance. The Inquisition, however, could deliver something far more dramatic: public execution, property confiscation, and the permanent destruction of reputations. The trial itself served a dual purpose. On the surface, it demonstrated the Church's vigilance in protecting moral purity. Beneath the surface, it was a calculated dismantling of a rival power base. The noblewoman's disgrace weakened her family's influence among the lesser nobility, who could no longer risk open association with them. The priest's removal allowed the bishop to appoint a more compliant cleric to the parish, one whose loyalty was unquestioned. The confiscation of property was another crucial element. Under inquisitorial law, the possessions of the condemned could be seized, with portions going to the cathedral, the crown, and the officials involved in the case. The bishopric gained not only land but also control over the agricultural output that came with it. The loss to the family was more than financial. It eroded their ability to maintain alliances through economic favors. Even the manner of execution was political theater. The procession through the streets, the display of the San Benito, and the public sermon were not simply tools of moral instruction. They were a warning to any who might think to challenge the bishop's authority. The fire was both punishment and proclamation. In private correspondence preserved in the archives, members of the bishop's court spoke openly about the advantage gained from the trial. One letter described the execution as a cleansing not only of the soul but of the land. Another noted that those who hesitate in their obedience will recall the lesson. These remarks make clear that the destruction of the two accused was intended to echo far beyond the confines of their personal lives. For the Inquisition, cases like this were ideal because they merged moral and political objectives. By framing political suppression as the defense of faith, the Church could silence opposition without appearing tyrannical. Anyone who protested the verdict could be accused of defending sin, a charge that carried its own dangers. The people, too, were drawn into this system. Participation in the spectacle of execution created a shared experience that reinforced the Church's narrative. Those who attended became part of the enforcement mechanism, carrying the story into every home and marketplace. Over time, the original details blurred, leaving only the official version, a story in which the Church had acted decisively to root out corruption. In the decades that followed, the noblewoman's family never regained its former standing. Their lands remained diminished, their influence curtailed. The parish, under new leadership, became a reliable source of revenue and support for the bishopric. The trial and execution, once shocking, faded into the background of community memory. leaving behind only the moral lesson the Church had chosen to preserve. The pyre had burned away 2 lives, but its smoke had carried a message far wider. That power cloaked in the language of faith was the most unassailable power of all. In the shadow of the cathedral, no rivalry was too strong, no family too proud to be broken by fire. In the months after the execution, life in the town resumed its familiar rhythms. Markets reopened, fields were tended, and sermons shifted to other matters. Yet beneath the surface, the fire that had consumed the noblewoman and the priest continued to smolder in the collective consciousness. The Church ensured that the story endured, not as an account of political rivalry or questionable justice, but as a moral warning. The sanbenitos, still hanging in the parish church, became fixtures of the building. Year after year, parishioners passed under them as they entered for Mass, their eyes drawn to the painted flames and the names written beneath. For children, the tunics were among their earliest lessons in obedience. For adults, they were silent reminders that the reach of the Inquisition could find anyone. In the official records, the trial was preserved with meticulous care. The confessions, extracted under torture, were copied in the hand of the tribunal scribe, bound in leather, and stored in the cathedral archives. Marginal notes recorded the precise dates of arrest, interrogation, and execution. The language was cold, clinical, and final, guilty of moral corruption. Delivered to the secular arm, justice executed. These documents, inaccessible to ordinary people, would remain in the Church's custody for centuries, shaping how future generations would know, or think they knew, the story. Outside the Church's walls, the memory took a different form. Among the townspeople, fragments of the real events persisted in whispers and private conversations. Some remembered the noblewoman's kindness, the priest's sermons, or the absence of true evidence against them. Others spoke of the boy forced to drink his mother's ashes, a detail never included in the official account. These stories were told quietly, often in kitchens or during long walks in the fields, and always with a glance over the shoulder. The family's fortunes never recovered. Their diminished lands could no longer support the network of alliances that had once protected them. Over time, their name faded from civic records, replaced by others more loyal to the bishopric. In this way, the execution achieved its long-term political purpose, the complete removal of a rival family from local power. For the boy now grown, the legacy was deeply personal. He carried the weight of his mother's public disgrace and the private trauma of the ritual imposed upon him. In a world where lineage determined opportunity, his identity as the heretic's son limited every path. He lived under the same church that had destroyed his family, bound by the same rituals and sacraments, but never able to forget what they had done in the name of salvation. The Inquisition's influence extended well beyond his lifetime. Generations later, when the sanbenitos were finally taken down, they were not destroyed. Instead, they were folded, catalogued, and placed in storage. Relics of discipline, preserved as proof of the Church's vigilance in past centuries. Even as the political climate shifted and inquisitorial trials became less common, the story remained accessible to those who knew where to look. Historians who would later study the case found themselves confronted with 2 legacies, the official record and the unofficial memory. The former spoke in the voice of authority, confident and absolute. The latter was fragmented, contradictory, and often unverifiable. But it carried the texture of lived experience, the hints of truth that survived beneath layers of fear. The event's broader impact was felt in how the community understood obedience. For decades, no one of rank or influence openly challenged the bishopric. Even when later disputes arose over taxes or land rights, the example of the pyre stood as an unspoken deterrent. The fire had burned for 2 people, but its smoke had settled over everyone. In the wider history of the Inquisition, the case was not exceptional. Similar stories unfolded in towns and cities across Europe, a pattern of public punishment serving both spiritual and political ends. What makes this one notable is how completely it encapsulates the machinery of control, accusation, isolation, confession, execution, and the long afterlife of shame. The legacy of such events is not only in what they destroyed, but in what they built. Through fear, The Church reinforced a system in which dissent was unthinkable, love was subject to regulation, and personal reputation was at the mercy of institutional power. The noblewoman and the priest were gone, but the architecture of authority that consumed them endured. Centuries later, when the story was retold in historical works, the language softened. The torture was described as interrogation, the execution as punishment according to the customs of the time. In this way, even the act of remembering was shaped to make the past seem less brutal than it had been. Yet the truth, the fear in the boy's eyes, the smell of smoke over the square, the deliberate erasure of 2 lives, remained, waiting for those willing to look beyond the official words. The fire in the square had long since turned to ash, but its heat lingered in memory. For the Church, it was a story of victory; for the family, a wound that never closed; and for history, it was proof that power, once wrapped in the language of righteousness, can burn through centuries without ever being extinguished. If this story has unsettled you, it's because history is not made only of triumphs. It is built on cruelty, fear, and the silence of those who survived. The execution you've just heard about was real, its legacy lasting far beyond the flames. If you believe these forgotten truths must be remembered, share this story. Subscribe for more accounts of humanity's darkest chapters, where power and faith shape destinies through fire, chains, and blood. Learn the past, not to glorify it, but to understand the cost of obedience and the price paid by those who dared to defy it.